Good morning and a very warm welcome to our new EuroCommerce policy talk. Today will be dedicated to the very important area of competition policy. And competition policy is, of course, a very important policy. First of all, it's an area where the EU has almost exclusive competence, a little bit like trade and a few other limited areas. So what's happening at the European Union is crucial for a very high number of business sector, but of course also for consumers. And of course for us as a retail and wholesale sector, which is the ultimate consumer facing and consumer serving sector, competition policy is of course very core. And serving also a consumer. The Competition Commissioner, Executive Vice President Vestager, said it a number of times. Our sector, like a number of other sectors, have played a crucial role in serving consumer, most particularly, of course, as we have all been able to witness over the last 18 months during the pandemic. And so to talk about competition policy, and there's a lot at stake. We are actually probably at the cusp of a fundamental change of competition policy, probably once in a decade or even more than that. A number of very important legislation, and new one and other ones to be revised. The Digital Markets Act, revision of the horizontal block exemption regulation, horizontal guidelines, vertical block exemption regulation and guidelines, market definition, merger control, state aid, which also have been under discussion during during the pandemic, and the competition Director General has played a very important role during the pandemic in ensuring that business could continue to survive. And when we are at the cusp of very important transformation, the recovery program ensuring proper resilience and a digital and green transformation of the businesses, competition policy next to the industrial policies is very much central to what is ahead of us. And so we're very pleased to have with us no one less than the Director General of DG Competition, Olivier Guersent, who Olivier, bonjour and welcome. And Olivier needs no introduction, but for those of you who do not know all his history, I think we can call Olivier a commissioned veteran, still a very dynamic one, but a veteran. Have been with the Commission for almost 30 years, and 20 or even a little bit more than 20 of those years have been spent on competition policy. He started his career actually in France in the famous DGCCRF, and that already in competition policy came into the European Commission, worked there until the moment to reach indeed about a year and a half ago as the Director General of DG Competition, with about 10 years, a little bit less than that, in the cabinet, head of cabinet of Commissioner Michel Barnier. That's how we got to know each other 10 years ago, in charge of services and the very important internal market, single market, and then as Director General of DG FISMA, in charge of financial services. So when Commissioner von der Leyen named Olivier Guersent as the head of DG Competition, I think Europe could not have a better person to lead a very important area. So Olivier, very warm welcome. We will hear from you true to our usual format from you for about 15 minutes in terms of what's ahead of us, particularly since we understand that in sort of about 2-3 weeks time, on November 17, the Commission is due to issue an important communication on the competition policy. So it'd be interesting to hear if you can lift the veil a little bit on what may be in that communication. And then we will have a question and answer. We've had many questions coming from our viewers and participants. By the way, we have more than 200 people who have signed up and participating in the show. So welcome to all of you. But then Christelle Delberg, my dear colleague, Executive Director for Competitiveness and Communication, and soon to be Director General, as I'm sure all of you have seen, will take over from me in a couple of weeks' time. But we'll moderate the discussion, take the Q&A with Olivier. So without further ado, Olivier, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, and thank you for your kind invitation to speak at your policy talk. It's always very interesting and important. I mean, to reach out to EuroCommerce, you mentioned we met 10 years ago, and we had a constant interaction ever since. It's a wide range of very important member companies that you gather together, and it's important to get the economy going in Europe, and it's important that you can benefit from a well-working single market, and this is a domain in which not only in competition policy, there's still quite a lot to do. Well, you said it. I mean, for the past couple of years, we've been implementing the biggest ever review of our competition policy instruments. We have been reviewing no less than 20 and something rules and guidelines and regulation. It's unprecedented. It's partly accidental because, regulations in particular and have time life, and they have review points. So a number of them converged in these 2 years. And it's partly deliberate because you said it, it was time to have a wider reflection. The last one we had really in antitrust was almost 20 years ago now, when we moved decisively towards regulation number 1, 2003. And there's, okay, what is the kind of competition policy we want in antitrust, so really antitrust centered, but also in state aids, to face the new challenges that are ahead of us, that are, broadly speaking, 3: the digital transition, the climate transition, and the building of a long-term competitive and resilient economy in Europe. And of course, these 3 challenges are closely interlinked, and they are the core of the strategies of firms, and it's important that we adapt competition policy to take care of it. Now, of course, the core, the mandate remains the same: protect the allocative efficiencies provided for well-functioning markets in a market economy, and in the end, benefiting to innovation, efficient cost structures, low prices, and quality choice for consumers. You'd asked me to leave the veil, and what we will say in a few weeks' time now, I won't. I would say it's for my commissioner, Margrethe Vestager, to lift any veil if she wishes so. What I can tell you is that what we want to do, because this review is largely ongoing, it's finished for some of the texts, it's almost finished for others, it's in the middle for other category, and sometimes it's just starting now. But I mean, what we want to do is put this in coherence and explain how it relates to the 3 challenges I have just explained, so that everybody understands clearly what is it we are doing, and not see a piecemeal of various texts that are being randomly reviewed. That's not what it is about. And of course, today I will not have time to go through all these reviews. What I can tell you is that the result of the studies and consultation we carried out in the frame of all these reviews is very clear, and that is that the fundamentals of competition policy, which, as you know, are not different in Europe and they are in other big jurisdictions like the United States, these fundamentals are fundamentally sound. But of course, we need to make some adaptation. Maybe a word on COVID before I go into the review. I mean, you've seen also that we have adapted not only to the long-term challenges that I've just enumerated, and I will come to how we adapt in a second, but also to the short-term challenge of the COVID crisis. And we have adapted in two ways, really, apart from like any organization adapting the way we're working. We have issued two temporary frameworks, one for antitrust and one for state aid. State aid has been extremely well working, and it has allowed member states to adapt flexibly to the crisis. And in my view, to have a decisive counter-cyclical action that shielded the economy. And you see how the economy boosts again to the point that we have shortages now in Europe. And I think this is because the policy response was adequate, and the temporary framework was part of that. But also to adapt the antitrust. And I've been something that none of my predecessors had done since the inception of Regulation 1, 2003. I have signed comfort letters. I have signed two comfort letters, one for the Association of Generic Medicines, in order to coordinate, to increase production of key medicines for intensive care units in the spring of 2020, at the heat of the first wave, where we were very, very close to a shortage in some of these key medicines. And the second one for the car manufacturers, in order to orderly restart production after it's been halted for months because of COVID. And going forward, because of the challenges long-term I've just enumerated, Mrs. Vestager has been clear that we intend to change the policy so far that was very strict on guidance, meaning very little guidance really provided to individual firms for individual cases, to relax this a bit, but only for, of course, important projects and genuinely new issues. I mean, if it's an old issue, well, your lawyers can provide for the self-assessment. So let me now come to the review and maybe focus on, in the interest of time, but in the question time, I'm happy to answer any question you may have, on those that are more likely to interest EuroCommerce members. I mentioned we have more than 20 recent or ongoing reviews. Let me focus on the vertical and the horizontals, because they really embody what we're trying to achieve with this thorough policy work. And they're also specifically important in retail distribution. We're updating both the guidelines and the block exemption regulations for horizontal and for vertical. And the goal here is really to support pro-competitive agreements, to enable the European industry to join forces to advance research effort, commercialize products, where this is necessary to reduce our dependencies and increase the resilience of our economy. But we also want to make sure that these rules remain fit for purpose to address the twin transition, as I said, digitization and climate change. So let's maybe first start with the horizontal block exemption regulation. Our starting point is that well-designed horizontal cooperation can bring about important efficiencies. When companies combine complementary assets or skills, and they can therefore operate more efficiently and create new products and services to the benefit of the consumers. And this is what the horizontal block exemption is about, and this is why it exempts certain categories of agreement from Article 101 of the treaty. These are two texts in reality, one that regards research and development agreement, and the other one so-called specialization agreements. And they are accompanied by the guidelines on horizontal cooperation agreement. All these texts are set to expire on the 31st of December 2022, so in a bit more than a year. And this is why already in 2019, we have launched the review process with a first public consultation that many of you answered to. We obtained evidence, we discussed with lawyers, with companies, we hold workshops, We've been holding workshops. We have discussed with our sister competition authorities within the ECN. And we focused on the small and medium-sized enterprises in particular. And all this evaluation demonstrated that the regulation and the guidelines are extremely useful instruments. There are a number of issues that should be improved in the text. Digitization, pursuit of sustainability goals in particular, in the interaction between competitors horizontally. So this revision process is currently ongoing. Last summer, we have launched a second public consultation, inviting stakeholders to comment on a number of policy options, distillated after the first one. And at the beginning of next year, we plan to publish a draft of the revised rule for a third round of consultation, taking stakeholder comments. And I mean, this process in which we consult 3 times the stakeholders, I think it's very important. I mean, that doesn't ensure we will get it right in the end, and we will have to make a policy judgment, of course. But it's important to listen, consult, evaluate the criticisms and the useful suggestion we received. Now, turning to the VBER, the vertical block exemption regulation, there as well we performed an evaluation, and this evaluation confirmed that the vertical block exemption regulation and the vertical guidelines that go together with it are still relevant, are useful tools for companies, but again, in order to facilitate self-assessment and to adapt to market reality, they need to be updated. Why is that so? Well, because there have been a number of market developments in the past years, notably the growth of online platforms and the appearance of new market players. Online platforms come immediately at mind. So the current vertical rules that were very much created in a context in which e-commerce was nascent need to be adapted to a context in which e-commerce is everywhere. And we need to address these issues. For this, we have proposed changes that are enshrined in a draft revised version. We are slightly more advanced for the vertical than we are for the horizontal, because the draft revised version has already been published in July, while for horizontals we will publish next January. We have currently finished the consultation on this draft revised version, and we are now thinking about the final calibration of the text. And in this context, let me just recall the 3 main objectives of the proposed changes that we want to bring to the vertical rules. First, we want to readjust the safe harbor of the vertical block exemption regulation, because we want to ensure that it only covers vertical agreements for which it can be assumed with sufficient certainty that they are efficiency enhancing, which means they fulfill the conditions of Article 101, paragraph 3. At the same time, we also want to address what we call false negatives under the VBER. False negatives are vertical agreements that are currently not covered by the vertical rules, but for which it can be assumed that they would fulfill the requirement for an exemption. Second, we want to provide stakeholders with an up-to-date guidance for a business environment that is completely reshaped by the growth of e-commerce and online platforms. And very important in this respect is to ensure a harmonized application of the treatment of vertical restrictions across EU, so that you can develop pan-European strategies you're not dealt with in different way, depending on the countries in which, the various countries in which you operate. And the third objective of this review is to try to reduce the compliance costs for firms by trying to simplify the current rules and streamlining the guidance. So the draft revised rules that we published in July attracted more than 150 very meaty and substantive contributions for all types of stakeholders, suppliers, distributors, associations, consumer associations, lawyers associations, professional associations, really a wide diversity, and this is very, very welcome. Let me just say a few words on the issue of sustainability, unsustainability agreement, because this came up as a topic under both the horizontal and the vertical rules. Of course, we do recognize that in order to encourage companies to jointly produce and distribute sustainable products, more guidance is needed. And this is because these decisions are quite committal for firms. I mean, you engage for years, sometimes decades, in very important projects with very significant resources involved. And if there is a competition uncertainty, if there is the least doubt that 3 years or 5 years down the road, we will come and say, well, sorry, you couldn't do that, well, firms will simply not do it. And we're very, very aware of this. And that's one of the reasons why my commissioner made clear already back in September last year that we intend to intensify guidance in that field. And we did that. We published just a month and a half ago, on the 10th of September, a policy brief that summarizes the main takeaway from the big debate we had launched in September 2020 in the speech referred to by Executive Vice President Vestager on how competition law can better support the Green Deal. And the policy brief also provides examples of concrete policy reforms across the competition instrument that are going in that direction. So I really encourage you to read this brief. It's available on our website, and it's quite interesting. And if I make it quick, our approach can be summarized as follows. Sustainability benefits can be assessed as cost efficiencies or qualitative efficiencies that can be passed on to consumers, and which form therefore part of the assessment in Article 101.3. And we believe that this allows to cover all the type of relevant actions to foster decarbonation, for example, while making sure that they are made in a way that is the least disturbing for competition. So this balance is very important between the restrictions, if any, under 101 paragraph 1, and the benefits under 101 paragraph 3. Of course, I'm very aware that there are voices pleading for a much broader approach, that any agreement that is good for the environment should be good for competition and be blessed. Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, let me give you an example. Imagine an agreement among Chinese steel producers that would restrict competition greatly, but would result into huge increases in prices for European customers. Would it be good to clear it under EU competition law? I'm not so sure. Of course, it would have environmental benefits on climate, and climate is a common good. But at the same time, it would have severe effects on restriction of competition without us having any means to find out whether there would have been least restrictive ways to achieve the same results. So for the time being, we will move with a small step, but that in our view allows to encapsulate all the possible agreements we can think of, and we shall see whether we need to enlarge further in view of agreements that are obviously beneficial and we find difficult to clear under 101.3. Now, the HBER and VBER are very technical. Their political relevance is limited, even if they are important for a number of companies and organizations, in particular EuroCommerce and its members. Equally important to you and much more political are our proposal for a Digital Market Act. And let me conclude by saying a word about it. The DMA is the result of intense and in-depth reflection, not only in the EU, in some also of our major trading partners, and you've certainly noticed what is happening in the USA at the moment, in order to see how we can be more effective in tackling the excessive exercising of power by large platforms that function as gatekeepers on a number of market, which allows them to deprive consumers for the variety of products and services, the innovation, and sometimes also the prices that they would otherwise be allowed to have. What we see is that competition policy has been quite effective, and actually it has been more effective in the EU than elsewhere because we've been front runners in implementing our competition rules in the field of digital platform for the last 20 years. But the digital world is characterized by very large and powerful network effects that deploy very, very quickly. And when this happens, you see that the impact of the practice is very quick. Take the first, just to make it simple, the first Microsoft case, the browser, if you remember it. So before Microsoft decided to introduce Explorer within its basic window offer in 1998, the world of browsers was dominated worldwide by a product called Netscape. And Netscape was having 90%, 90, of the world market. Everybody agrees that Internet Explorer was a less good, less innovative, less performing product than Netscape. And yet, because it was included into Windows seemingly for free, after 6 months, Netscape market share was 10%. After 1 year, it had disappeared. And we found 5 years later that this was an infringement of competition rules, and we sanctioned Microsoft. But of course, Netscape and any other competitor were long time dead. So whatever the huge fines that we imposed, the damage was done. And this is exactly what we want to prevent with the DMA. We know that some practices, like all forms of self-preferencing, for example, when they are implemented by these large platforms, they have invariably, always, detrimental effects on competitors and consumers. Take self-preferencing, for example, for Google own ads in their search engine. That is very clear. I mean, the day you're put in page 26, your business model is gone. Irrespective of how good you are, how much the consumers like you. So what we decided to do with the DMA is, because these practices are always bad when they are put into effect by these big platforms, we prohibit them. So in a way, what we did is we equipped, in this very field, Europe with a law on restrictive practices, as they say in the member states. It's not competition law, strictly speaking, because you don't have to demonstrate that the market is affected. You don't have to demonstrate that the player is dominant. If you are a designated player, and if you put in place one of the prohibited practices, you're in infringement, period. So you should not do it. You're outright banned from doing it. So I think this is going to be a very important development. It's watched all over the world. It's, of course, complicated to calibrate, and it will need to work hand in hand with the enforcement of competition policy. So that doesn't mean we will stop enforcing competition policy in digital, but that's really one of the big challenges of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Olivier. And you've covered a lot of ground, and ground on which I'm sure we have a number of questions ourselves and also from our viewers, and even some areas you haven't covered. I mean, payments is one of them. I mean, I do remember when you were with Michel Barnier, I think that you were very strong in addressing that, and we see, unfortunately, that issue there coming back. So maybe we can cover that in some of the questions as well. And I'm certainly also curious to hear you mention what briefly mentioned in the development in the United States, with I think it's some stronger involvement of the FTC. So it'd be interesting to see if there is some possible rapprochement there between the US and EU policy on competition as well. But let me hand over to Christelle to see how she will and she will probably structure the discussion around certain themes and the questions to you. Christelle, over to you.
Thank you, Christian, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Olivier, for sharing your the agenda, and a very busy agenda from a competition law perspective. And as you said, one of the biggest overhaul of competition policy taking place at the moment. Yes, I suggest that we structure the follow-up interview in 4 blocks, if time allows. The first one will be looking at the regulatory framework for Fit for Digital, looking at the verticals and the DMA, as you have briefly touched upon. The second one, looking at competition rules and a little bit of a more deep dive into the food sector, where a lot of discussions are taking place and fundamental review processes also taking place. Then to go a little bit more into the sustainability chapter and what's in there for us as a sector, and how we can competition rules can help whilst maintaining a strong competition standard, and finally around payments, if we can, where we are concerned with some recent developments on the market.
That's very meaty for a half hour.
It's very meaty, so let's try and do that a little bit quickly. But just if I can just have a little bit of an introduction about where we're coming from on the verticals and the DMA and digitalization. We're coming from a situation where the consumers nowadays are using all forms of variations of online and offline channels. They've got, with COVID, they've got used to it. They are going to continue to use these new sales channels and new ways of interacting. Manufacturers, with the technology, with COVID, have massively expanded their direct-to-consumer sales channels, and therefore have become more direct competitors to their networks of independent resellers. And at the same time, the marketplace environment has grown very much, but also is playing an important role for the third-party sellers who are able and have been able through COVID to have access to customer groups, and they still need to have access to those customer groups in the future. So that's a little bit the environment in which we operate as a sector. Just a couple of questions in relation to the Weber and the DMA. The first one is in relation to the consumer standards. And the question is, how can the Commission ensure through the review process that the vertical rules remain channel neutral and preserve as their key objective consumer welfare in the form of better prices, better choice, and better innovation? I mean, we're thinking here about provisions on dual pricing, RPM, minimum advertised prices, dual pricing, and online sales restrictions. So there's a whole raft of provisions there. The second part is in terms of the integrity of the single market. Retailers cannot and wholesalers cannot buy or source in the single market today from their big brands suppliers. They are forced to source in the countries where they operate their stores, and therefore cannot benefit from the single market. So the question is, what safeguards is the Commission considering to ensure the integrity of the single market through the revision of the competition framework? And in relation to the DMA, you mentioned about legislation with do's and don'ts. But then the question is, how can we make sure that those rules remain adaptable to and workable to the business models, in particular, in our case, of the circumstances of the marketplaces, and also continue to provide incentives for them, the bigger ones, but also the other ones, to continue to grow and innovate in Europe? Thank you, Olivier. I know it's a lot, but thank you.
Well, I tried to be both precise and reasonably contained in time. So your first question is really about channel neutrality in the end of the day. And the context is really the rise in importance of online sales and the omni-channel experience that consumers expect nowadays. We need to ensure that at the same time, retailers, and that includes SMEs as well, can sell online, but that investments in the traditional shops, brick and mortar, are not discouraged. So that we all continue to have a choice between going offline and shopping, which personally I prefer, but that's because I'm old. So virtual shops, not my taste. People that like it should be able to do it, but I should continue to be able to find a wide choice of lively stores when I walk in the city. So just to recall where we are today, online sales are considered as a form of passive sales because they allow companies to reach more and different customers compared to more traditional sales channels. And this means that restrictions that prevent distributors from selling through the internet are considered hardcore restrictions under the VBER and by object restrictions of Article 101. So if you take the current rules, and I come in a second to the new ones, this also includes a number of indirect measures that are designed to make online sales more complicated, charging the same distributor a higher wholesale price when products are intended to be sold online only, for example, so-called dual pricing, imposing criteria for online sales that are not overall equivalent to the criteria imposed in physical stores, so-called equivalence principle in the context of selective distribution. So what our evaluation has shown is that online sales have developed a lot during the last decade. So you would tell me you didn't need a scientific evaluation to see that. And the brick and mortar traditional stores face increasing pressure. And a number of stakeholders have therefore called for more flexibility to allow them to support investments in the brick and mortar stores in an appropriate manner. In a way, we are in the reverse situation we were when we produced the current guidelines, where it was the all-powerful real economy trying to impede the development of internet sales. And now we need, in a way, to protect the continuity of the shopping experience in the real life. So this is against this background that we designed the new rules, and we propose to allow dual pricing, and therefore remove the principle, but at the same time establish a principle that applies more generally to online restrictions. And this principle is that restrictions shall not go directly or indirectly in isolation or in combination with other factors. They cannot have as their object to prevent the buyers or their customers from effectively using the internet for the purpose of selling their goods or services, of course. And that, I think, provides for a principle that should allow in individual cases to preserve the delicate balance, because we want to have a thriving internet sales development, but we want to continue to have shops. And the challenge will be to caliber our policy to that effect. On territorial supply constraint, of course, we know that it has an impact in the EU. I mean, this is basically trying to restrict the ability to source for another country in the EU, or actually elsewhere. But in the EU, of course, there's a clear single market problem. And as you know, we have quite a body of enforcement in that respect. I don't want to go through the long list, but the decisions against AB InBev, for example, Nike, Sanrio, NBC Universal in the merchandising case, a number of decisions as well by your colleagues from national competition authorities. So we've been acting, and we intend to continue to be. What we plan to do in the context of the vertical block exemption regulation is to update the guidance on types and forms of territorial supply constraints in the new vertical guidelines. And by this, we want to allow companies that are subject to these constraints to more easily identify the different forms and report them to the Commission National Competition, so that we can act more swiftly. Just maybe a point of attention, and that is that EU competition rules do not and will continue not to capture this type of constraints when they agreed between a vertically integrated non-dominant company and its national subsidiaries. So within the group, provided you're not dominant, of course you can continue to have this. And your last point was on the DMA, how to keep it adaptable. Well, that's the most difficult of your three questions, because it's the point that is currently being debated both in Parliament and in Council. What I believe is that we need to find an equilibrium between keeping a rule that is clear, ex ante, self-executable, and provides a certain degree of legal certainty for companies, and at the same time that it is adaptable to the virtually limitless imagination of big tech firms and their lawyers, in order that they do not develop different practices, but that reach exactly the same effect. For this, we have a number of things. We have an anti-circumvention mechanism that is inbuilt in the DMA, and that tries to see just this. We have huge discussion at the moment with the member states on how to exactly define the practices in Article 6. Don't want to be too technical here. We have also the general investigations that we can run under Article 17. So the DMA itself provides for a certain number of tools that allow to prevent circumvention of the prohibition and update the DMA. And of course, and I said that in my initial remark, we fully intend to make full use of our power under Article 102. The DMA doesn't mean at all, in my view, diminution of enforcement under Article 102. And part of this enforcement will be precisely to tackle the new practices that cannot be construed as circumvention of the DMA, but have exactly the same detrimental impact on competition. And for this, we will use 102 the way we've been doing for the last 20 years. And when we make a final determination that a practice is very detrimental to competition and consumers, then we will feed that into the ex ante prohibition of the DMA through a delegated act.
Thank you, Olivier, and that is very clear, and certainly worth a whole discussion in itself. If we can move on to the practices in the food sector, and I think I will combine that with questions on sustainability. But in foods, through the horizontal review, the Commission is looking at the joint purchasing agreements, provisions on joint purchasing. In our sector, joint purchasing is a way for retailers and wholesalers to combine forces, to pull together forces to create synergies for sourcing in the single market. As I mentioned, territorial supply restrictions fragments the single market, and alliances are one of the mechanisms to try and mitigate that impact. when retailers and wholesalers are facing very powerful global suppliers that are still making significant margins. So through the review process, how do you see the review process going on, and how can we seek to get perhaps a greater recognition of the pro-competitive role that joint purchasing plays in the economy in particular? And we've seen that also with the vaccine strategy, that it is helpful in other sectors in the wider economy. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, I mean, you have two issues really. You have the general issue of joint purchasing agreements, and you have the specific issue of retail alliances, super central, as we used to say when I was an investigator in France. Let me maybe address briefly the general and the particular. The horizontal guideline, I mean, it's really at the core of these guidelines to provide guidance on joint purchasing agreements. And in particular, how retailers can team up or not in so-called retail alliances. The current guidelines recognize that the creation of some degree of buying power can normally be expected. Of course, I mean, that's basically the goal. And that it can be expected also to benefit consumers if the retailers do not have market power on the downstream selling market. In other words, in that case, that fuels competition, of course, rather than restricting it. There is a different issue about the joint buying power that is probably a bit more complicated. But on the downstream market, it is quite easy. So what are we doing now? We are still reflecting. So pardon me if I'm not too precise. And we are reflecting on whether, and if yes, how, we need to change our approach to joint purchasing agreement. This was one of the big issues raised in the evaluation. And the main points that were identified are three. First, that the distinction isn't clear between a buyer cartel and a legitimate joint purchasing agreement, and that the Commission should clarify that. Second, that we need to give more prominence to potential anti-competitive effects upstream, the point I was making, the effect of concentration that it may lead to on the supply market upstream. And third, that more guidance and more examples should be given on particular practices in the retail sector. So these are the 3 points we're reflecting on. You know that the public consultation, I said it in my introduction, is just finished. And therefore, it's a bit early to tell you how we intend to take forward these points at this moment in time. We're currently finishing to analyze the replies and thinking about what are our options, which we will specify in the next step, which is to impact assess the various options before making the choice for one of them. Now, you know that there are also a number of member states in which there is a push for the source local, which is also a push by consumers to be frank. And of course, I mean, we are actively active to try to defragment the single market as much as we can. At the same time, as a conscious consumer, for example, I appreciate to have a marking on my milk that tells me that the milk was harvested 10 kilometers away from Brussels, rather than it had traveled all throughout Europe, and I'm happy to pay a couple of cents more for that. So there is a fine line here between information of the consumer and practices that are labeling, like we had recently in Finland, not always to take the French as an example, where they labeled their milk Finnish milk. Of course, Finnish milk is different. I don't care so much whether my milk is Belgian. What I care is that it didn't travel 1,000 kilometers. But it may be French or it may be Dutch. You see? So this kind of nationalism is a problem. But buy local charters, for example, among retailers, these initiatives are often justified by the idea that local food is decisively more environmentally sustainable because of reduced transport. This may, of course, be misleading in some cases, because transport is not everything about the carbon content of a product. But I think this is an issue that we should approach with caution and based on facts. Anything that is transparent, displays the carbon outlook of a product, for example, is very welcome for me. Anything that is based on the premisings that buy national is better or buy local is better, by the very definition, without any evidence supporting it, it's probably an issue in terms of competition policy.
Thank you. That's helpful, very helpful guidance indeed. In particular, in relation to the developments on the national, the many developments on the national level. I'm very conscious of the time that we have here. I'd like to move on to payments because this is another area where a lot of pressure is being exerted, and in particular in the context of COVID, where the explosive growth in the card schemes fees are now costing merchants an additional 1.5 billion euros, and that's a real concern for our sector. There's also consolidation in the open banking sector, which also is creating competition concerns and in particular their impact on consumers. So here, really, questions is about. So there's evidence of payments being made by the schemes to card issuers in breach of the interchange fee regulation, which raises questions as to whether the behavior is compatible with Article 101. Is the Commission going to be able to take action on those? And also in relation to competition and mergers and acquisitions in this area, the takeover of open banking competitors such as Tink and Plaid in the US, that has a lot of other less visible potential competitors by Visa and MasterCard, but also raises questions around preemption of competition. So the question is whether this process of absorbing potential competitors to existing international card schemes, an area which the Commission is going to consider in the future.
Well, thank you, Christelle. Two different but very linked questions indeed. Well, first of all, I want to reassure you that we're really committed to address structural issues that are preventing the good functioning of the internal market in retail payments. And if necessary, to consider possible regulatory solutions, other solutions were relevant. So you know that the Commission's report on the application of the interchange fees regulation, which is funny because I was on the other end of it. I was on the regulatory side when we teamed up with DG Competition some years ago to produce that regulation. And it's not completely evident for a competition agency to go into price regulation, I can tell you. Because we always have a questioning whether this is effective and efficient. But anyway, this is where we are, and it brought some results. I'll come to that in a moment. And we made a report in June last year. And indeed, that report, in my view, evidenced quite clearly that a number of positive results have been achieved. And that therefore it's too early to decide on whether we need to review that system. But scheme fees are not within the scope of the interchange fee regulation. And there are a number of uncertainties about possible larger scheme fee increases by international card schemes after 2018, and their impact on merchant charges, which is, I assume, what you're worried about. So what we're doing is my colleagues in Directorate D, which you are in close contact with, are currently collecting and analyzing huge amounts of data. And they've been in contact with a number of stakeholders, as I said, including you. We have had a number of fruitful meetings, one of which I was pleased to attend with Christian, with EuroCommerce. And our case team in charge is in regular contact with you on this matter. We have also reached out to other stakeholders. We have sent questionnaires in the market, and we are currently analyzing the answers. And of course, if it is necessary, we will consider appropriate action. As I said, that might be either under the interchange fee regulations, under possible new regulation, or under competition rules, as the case may be. I can't say much more on this first question at this stage of the investigation. So the second question is on takeover. If I have still three minutes, so I'll try to cover that quickly. So the Commission has published guidance in March this year on the application of the referral mechanism set out in Article 22. And I'm sure you know that it is generating a passionate debate across Europe and in the legal community. This comes as a result of a quite extensive work, and we are convinced that this is the most efficient and least burdensome way for business to deal with this issue of capturing transactions that escape any major control system, and yet have the potential to be very negative for competition. So there is an enforcement gap, and it applies to several sectors. Digital, very obviously, and the Illuminated Grail case that we have currently dealing with comes to mind, but also pharma or biotech, for example. I mean, all these sectors in which the firms that are bought and that have a huge competition potential have very often very little or even zero sales at the time they're bought. So what we have been doing in this context is not changing our interpretation of Article 22. Our interpretation has always been that member states can trigger Article 22 referral even where they do not have national competence. And actually, the reason why we are certain that this interpretation is right is because this is the very reason why the Dutch and Luxembourg states, when the merger regulation was negotiated in the late 80s, requested Article 22 to be introduced in the regulation. So it's important to keep in mind. Now, what we do is, previously we were actively discouraging member states to use it when they do not have national competence, and we are now actively encouraging them to use it. Now, if I come to your point, the acquisition of Tink by Visa, it did not fulfill any of the threshold under the EU merger regulation. And it is actually not really an example for a killer acquisition that escaped merger control scrutiny, because it was notified and it was assessed by our German colleagues. And the system we have in the EU is that, of course, they could have chosen to refer it up through Article 22, very traditional interpretation, or not, and deal with it themselves, which they chose to do.
Thank you very much. I think, and it's perfect timing. It is 11 o'clock, and Olivier, I think perfect. I think we have to conclude, but there is definitely scope for doing more. Just a couple of maybe concluding words from my side. I think on payments, we're glad indeed. We had a first meeting about a year ago, or a little bit less than that, and I think we did complained a little bit indeed on some inaction by the European Commission on some of those issues, particularly since the results of the study, I think it was an Ernst & Young study, I think stopped about a year and a half or 2 years ago, and we saw the massive increase in fees, very much circumventing the IFR regulations, also increasing in commercial cards versus consumer cards. So I think we're glad to hear from you that the Commission will look into that, because our conclusion is that we have, basically retailers have lost all the benefits that we're supposed to gain from the IFR regulation from 2015. So I think it is becoming indeed rather urgent that the Commission looks into it, indeed seriously, and consider some action. Among those, indeed, possible revision of and extending the scope of the IFR regulation. The other thing, thank you for having clarified a number of issues on the horizontal guidelines. I think from the point of view of indeed joint, purchasing alliances, this is crucial, particularly in the evolution of the retail sector that is transforming in a very significant way. What we actually strive for is indeed for a proper, competitive omni-channel retailing, because, as you said, the stores continue to be very important, not only from a consumer choice, but also from the point of view of the livelihood of our communities or cities and towns and villages, and therefore I think it is quite important to ensure that indeed, in view of also the significant power also on the supplying side, to ensure that indeed, for retailers it is quite difficult, certainly for when you have a lot of assets, fixed assets in terms of brick and mortar stores, to be really quickly competitive in a number of member states, and therefore I think bound to very often local markets, and therefore I think indeed purchasing groups are one of the way to countervail a little bit the what we see also in the marketplace. So I think it's quite important. In fact, the Commission services highlighted there's about 14 billion euros of money left on the table, if you like, for in terms of consumer purchasing power as a result of those. So I mean, we hope that indeed clarity and continued commercial freedom will prevail through the process. So with that, Olivier, let me thank you very much for frankness and openness and clear. And of course, there are certain things that you cannot disclose, and you will leave to Margrethe Vestager to disclose. We will look with interest, listen to interest on November 17. And really thank you for also you and your colleague for openness and very good cooperation to try to have indeed a proper competition framework for the future of Europe, and of course in particular for retail and wholesale. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Christian. Best of luck for the next challenges, and bonne chance, Christelle.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all, and thank you to all our viewers. Hope you found this interesting, and you will be able to listen again. It will be on our website as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.